I'm Alexandra Jones, I'm the Chief Executive of Centre for Cities, and today we're talking about how we can build a stronger and healthier democracy. It's hot on the heels of local elections, which generated a great deal of public debate, but where more than 3 out of 5 people didn't bother to vote. It's a year before the general election, so it's an important time to be having a discussion about how we can build a stronger and healthier democracy. And I think the rise of UKIP here and populism across Europe more generally creates a very important backdrop to be having this conversation too. Parties like UKIP, the Front National, they're arguing for ideas seen to represent the common people against an out-of-touch elite. It's not new, but in an age where actually you've got technology that could bring people closer together, it's interesting that it doesn't seem to be bringing national politicians closer to local communities. I think it's important to have a debate about that. People are very cynical about politics, but what's striking is they're less cynical about local politics. An Ipsos Mori survey showed that 79% of people trusted their council to make good decisions about public services. It was 11% for their local MP. So I think this discussion, we'll be talking about powers, we'll be talking about trust, democracy, where decisions get made, and I think it'll be a really lively and interesting 40 minutes. And I'm delighted to be here with such a great panel of speakers. We've got Chris Brown, Chief Executive of Igloo Regeneration. Chris is also, well, you've advised loads of people on regeneration. You do a great deal as well on citizen participation, citizen democracy, so really interested in your thoughts on that. We've got Giles Wilkes, blogger at Freethinking Economist, former special advisor to Vince Cable and former chief economist at Centre Forum. So I think a really interesting perspective, having just come out of the heart of government, on how much central government love giving power away. Mm-hmm. And then Darren Hughes, Deputy Chief Executive of the Electoral Reform Society, but you have been one of those MPs, Labour MP in New Zealand, over 3 parliaments, and I think a real advocate for proportional representation as well. So 3 great people to talk about this, and I suppose I just wanted to open up the discussion really about powers. And who has most say, really? So if we're trying to kind of build a stronger and healthier democracy, who has most say over what happens in UK cities? Is it citizens, people who vote, or actually is it some of the faceless bureaucrats and Whitehall? I mean, Darren, your thoughts, particularly given your experiences in New Zealand?
Well, I think at base level, the people are sovereign for one day on polling day, and they hold all the power, and there's no question that the results aren't followed. So something that's always a very easy thing to be blasé about is a very important principle in our system. The results are accepted, so clearly citizens are in charge then. The difficulty is it feels as though all that power evaporates the moment that the ballot papers have been counted, and that many decisions that are taken, or more importantly the decisions that are implemented, are done without citizen involvement and are done very much by people who are paid to be the civil servants. And I think that does create a real tension. It's enormous power briefly, and then no power for a long period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Chris, is that your experience?
I completely agree with that. I think you've got to differentiate between power over what. People want to be in control of some things, and they're very happy to let somebody else make decisions on other things. You know, they're not particularly interested in whether we send the army down one street in Iran or another street in Iran. They're quite interested in whether we send the army to Iran, but they're actually as interested in where the car parking spaces go on the street outside their house. So it's getting the right things in the right place in terms of powers, I think.
I think from the point of view of central government, they often look at the localities and think they've got great powers just to say no to things, and they're very good at stopping things, in particular in the planning system. But they don't have the capabilities to make the decisions you need to be proactive and plan things anew. I mean, the coalition government came in with an extremely, you might almost call a Panglossian degree of optimism about what localism could do. It started up with strategies like introducing neighbourhood plans in the planning system, which were premised on the idea that you can get local people to proactively produce plans and implement them, and as a result get more things done. There have been several blows to this vision. One of them is that the economic slowdown made everybody extremely cynical about any giving away of power whatsoever. They thought we've got one shot to get this right, and people simply didn't trust devolved incentives to do this. But the other one was when we asked the people through things like the police commissioner elections or the elections to see whether people wanted mayors, the overwhelming reaction was either cynicism or just negativity. Mayors were rejected time and time again. They were only got in through Liverpool in a process of rather centralist bargaining, where we said, well, you can have a mayor if we give you this. It's a kind of very centralist version of decentralisation, where you can only have the policies that we decide you have. So you can understand people in the centre believing in the abstract case for local powers, but when it comes to delivering them, it's been extremely difficult, and they've been wondering, well, what's in it for them?
I think the neighbourhood planning one is particularly, in fact, all those examples are interesting, because I don't think most citizens are particularly interested in how the police is run from a democratic point of view. They just expect it to be run well. But neighbourhood planning, people are much more interested in. And from the other end of the telescope, I've seen examples of local authorities being the blockers to neighbourhood planning. They're the people who are trying to stop citizens taking power away from them, and that's both at local politician and council officer level. So we've got an example just around the corner from where we are at the moment, where we're 2 years in to a process where the community wants to do a plan for its neighbourhood, and the local authority is stopping them. That's a very strange example of localism.
What do they not like about the plan?
It's not the plan they don't like, it's the process. They don't. It feels like they don't want to give up the power.
Right.
So from that end of the telescope, it feels like central government is doing more to give citizens and communities power over the things they're interested in at neighbourhood level than local government.
Right.
But I mean, I think there is an interesting conversation about that, isn't it? Because power, when you're trying to push power down, it needs to be pushed down at different levels. And it's your point, really. What do you want power over, and where do you want to make decisions? What do you want to make decisions about, and at what level? So you're right. There won't be lots of people in Southwark trying to have a very detailed conversation about Iran, but there would be about building. And there's something very interesting about what happens when a local authority's got a different view to the citizens, but also when central government. So your point about the frustrations about getting things built.
Yes.
So in beautiful leafy Oxfordshire, where the demand for houses is massive, Oxford is the least affordable city in the country. Nobody wants houses built.
Yeah.
And if you ask the local people, they will keep saying no,
Yeah.
because there are few incentives big enough for wealthy Oxfordshire to say, yes, okay, let's build lots of houses. So, there's something interesting in that.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the Oxford example, actually. I'm
You think it's not the least
well,
affordable?
one of the shortlisted entries for the Wolfson Garden City Prize is very focused on whether it is possible to convince the people of Oxford that more housing is a good idea, and I suspect they will make some progress. I think
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
there are things around public transport, accessibility of the city centre, quality of the places that are created. That's the key one. That I think will mean that people will recognise that there is a model of Oxford which is a bigger Oxford but a better Oxford. But that does go to the heart of our of the power point. If from the centre, and the centre actually doesn't need to be national, it could be local, we're saying these fields will be housing, it's not surprising you get a negative reaction. If you turn it around and get incentives in the right place and get the power in the right place, I think you might be surprised at what you achieve.
I think that's fair, but it's who creates those incentives as well?
What's the right level of the right place? I mean, I remember the process by which, one of the attempts to localise things, and I appreciate that after what you said about local authorities, maybe localise isn't necessarily all the right word, but one of those attempts was the creation of local enterprise partnerships, and as local elites presumably meant to reflect local economic geography, but even at the time it felt to me possibly at risk of incredible arbitrariness. Two chief executives from two local authorities happen to get on them, they might combine, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily the right economic unit. They might be crossing across city boundaries all the time. There's naturally a trade-off between the larger areas will encompass more of the will be able to take into account more of the externalities and make sort of bigger, more rational decisions, perhaps, and it will certainly be able to husband resources and be more efficient, but then they're going to be further away from the people. From what I could see up front, it was just a competition between glossy brochures. and see who actually had the right sort of teams to say credible things. And the first cuts were sometimes disastrous. And so, there was, again, a very optimistic vision that somehow if you bubble things up in an incredible rush, you will produce areas that are rational. But as Alex just said, that it probably applies differently for different questions. You want some planning issues to be extremely local. Some of them you will need to be bigger. I mean, you can't plan a road.
And I think that there's a big organisational point in there, isn't there? But that's where the tensions all take place. There's no central government politician saying what we really need to do is bring power back to Whitehall. Everyone's saying we need to give power away, we need to give decision-making power, we need to give funding and budgets away. And these are not difficult things to agree with, but they are very challenging to organise effectively. The example you just gave, you put together a new committee, but where does the accountability lie for that? There's no sense that politicians elected by local people, they hold the notional power of the community, but often can be seen as being out of touch. Just because a particular neighbourhood of people come together, that doesn't give them mystical, magical powers of accountability back to their neighbours. And when things go wrong, people run for the hills. So you need to have proper thought-through structures. And I think the criticism, things like the Police and Crime Commissioner posts the decision to have the referendums on having mayors, was that the bright idea wasn't followed up with the kind of detailed work for how the benefits can be captured, but also how do we manage this when inevitably there's some failure? Because then that's when the blame game starts and there's no one to be seen to take accountability for it.
And I think that's one of the interesting things about devolution. So we live in a country that's one of the most centralised in the advanced world. You know, it's hugely centralised. Absolutely. And it hasn't worked that well either. So it would be all right if perhaps it had worked, but it hasn't worked that well. But one of the challenges is accepting failure and accepting risk, and with innovation comes failure. And I think that there's something about the local and the national culture that's quite interesting about that blame game. We're starting to talk about that just a little bit earlier, about who gets the blame if something does go wrong? Is it the Secretary of State? In which case, do they just want to keep their hands on everything?
And it's not a time-consistent promise to say we will let so-and-so fall over. I mean, we will let Wandsworth have its own economic plan and borrow money and really have skin in the game, and this way it will really behave in a pro-growth way. But then if it falls over, in America they have an accepted model that authorities do fall over, their bonds default, they trade at different yields, and people stand by and watch it happen. Nobody has shown that we have that time consistency, ability to make that sort of a promise and later not come in and rescue. And the Treasury knows this, so the Treasury looks at all of these authorities having their own aspirations and thinks, I'm paying the bill if this goes wrong, so why the hell should I?
The Detroit example of going bankrupt is not something that will be countenanced here, is it?
No, but it's interesting how often Detroit comes up as well, because there's nowhere we're anywhere near that in this country. But actually people constantly say to us, well, if we gave a little bit more power to cities, we'd be talking about a little bit. Well, we'd have Detroits all over the country. I think it's
which doesn't follow at all.
And that's interesting to me, that the debate here is about blame and accountability, rather than about what would we need to do practically to make, for example, local enterprise partnerships work really well, or neighbourhood level organisations work really well. And this is where government seems to fall down. It's in that the practical kind of, if this was a business, what would we need to do to succeed?
And why do you think that is? Because this is your point as well, Darren, wasn't it? Institutions, and then you were saying as well, Giles, you need the institutions, of course you do, this is a debate that's often quite a passionate one about democracy and power to people, but actually the technocratic side that really makes it work is the institutions. And do you think it's because government tries to design all of the institutions from the centre, so devolving in a paternalistic way? Is it because we did it too quickly, which was one of the points, or is it just that we're expecting too much too soon?
Too often is one of the reasons. I wish I could remember there's a chart somewhere showing all of the different attempts. It might have been produced by Centre for Cities, but it was an excellent chart. And it showed all the different attempts through time to separate things off. And you'll remember some of them. I mean, obviously there were the RDAs, but there were development councils before that. We've had local enterprise partnerships and city deals. We've got local, we're going to have deals with LEPs as well. And often these all intersect with each other. I mean, at the beginning, the LEP map looked like something quite extraordinary. It would put you off trying to invade the country. And people were having philosophical arguments. Where do you allow some areas not to have a LEP? At the time, it felt like this means you will not get access to the central government money kitty, so we demand one right now. So, so it's incredibly arbitrary and scattered. But I hear that some of the countries that are good at this are also that way, like France. I mean, how complex is the patchwork of local authority accountability in France? It must be extraordinary. How many mayors do they have?
Yeah, my concern about France there is the system is such that there's kind of an incentive for small c corruption. You know, in order to get things done, you have to do deals with different levels of government on a regular basis.
Why is that corruption?
Well, I use small c, but yeah, those favours take you into a way of doing business, which I think is we would regard as un-British.
Opaque.
But you mentioned money, and it does seem to me that the money is key. While somebody else has control of the funding for whatever level of organisation, there'll always be an incentive to interfere.
Yeah.
If that stream of revenue is coming direct to an organisation, there's an automatic kind of sense of responsibility and an independence, and that's, I think, missing from pretty much all levels of government below national government and treasury.
So it's all raised, it all goes to the centre and then gets reallocated, or even when local government has got money, and we've done work on this, there's so many rules and regulations about how you can spend it, and council tax you've got raised, that actually
And so much work goes on to prepare applications, plans, and then to justify what you've just done.
Absolutely.
And people say, what's the point, that this is all small beer, it's not worth the effort. Taking your point about France, and just going a bit more wider on that, I mean, all of these models will be, there's a risk of them being accused of being hijacked. You use the word corruption. In the end, decisions have to be made about what providers to use to carry out these things. We've been discussing structure. Largely, these are structures of government of some description, either Whitehall or council departments, chambers of commerce, representation organisations, think tanks. It takes a long way to get through these things before you get to operational people, business people who are actually providing services, to have them as part of the equation to do the things that we are saying should be devolved. And at the point where choices need to be made, someone misses out. So you could be a business owner in a community where some of these wonderful devolution plans take place, but you still miss out because not everyone can get it. And the first instinct will be to say, oh, it's all a jack up and it's all about who you know and all these. So some of these basic problems won't go away, but that's not any reason not to do it. It's just a way of, it's just a reminder to be aware going into these models, all the various factors that you're going to have to deal with. It's not going to be joy and sunshine because all of a sudden the decision is taken in a neighbourhood, not in a department. There's still going to be consequences, disappointment and challenges.
I think that's a lovely challenge. So the example I'd use is parks maintenance. It makes a huge amount of sense for, at a local government level in the UK, for that to be outsourced to a private contractor. But it also makes an awful lot of sense for the people who live close to the park to have a community organisation, a Friends of the Park organisation, and to have a managerial say in the activities of that contractor in that park. And that suggests a partnership between different levels of government. All those things, I think, are very easy to do if you have the right mindset. And I'm quite interested in the example of there's a group of local authorities who are calling themselves cooperative councils, and they seem to be moving on this journey down to how can we interact with communities, with groups of citizens, to make our services better suited to their needs.
This idea of co-production of
Absolutely.
services.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I mean, just thinking about, the stronger, healthier democracy idea, trust is a big part of this, isn't it?
Yeah.
So building trust. What's interesting looking around the world, you've got places like Boston where they've got apps to engage people in delivery of services in the city. So I don't know if you know about the pothole app where you report a pothole and you get things back, or there's, you can engage with people, you report there's a problem and they come back to you, and there's one where somebody had a raccoon in their dustbin. And they put it up on the site, and then somebody was nearby and helped deal with it, and you win social capital points. But there's all sorts of really interesting apps, but those points about what happens when you want to get cooperation, co-production, would more of that build trust at a local level, given we have got such a problem, a crisis of trust really in politicians and political decisions and some of the ways things happen, and you can see that in this country from the expenses scandal right through, but it's clearly much wider than this country. Do you think it would help, or do you think, I mean, your point, there is no panacea, there's no perfect situation where trust will be thriving. Do you think it would help?
I think there is an interesting kind of moment in terms of the innovation of the technology. I'm based in Shoreditch, in the middle of this kind of wild east phenomenon that's going on around Tech City. But there's people in there who are, for example, producing apps that allow local communities to work out which bits of their neighbourhood need improving. I'm also, around here where we're sitting at the moment, there's a couple of fantastic hyper-local news medias. There's SE1 in this part of town, and there's people like Brixton Buzz. And if you could connect those two things so that the hyperlocal media are part of that process of publicising the opportunities for interaction, I think you've got a really interesting model for very, very local governance. And the trust that would come out of that would be enormous.
But do they then have the powers to do something about it? I mean, do we have the equivalent of the budget for the raccoon removal man? I mean, it's great being able to get information out, and that's what apps are very good for. But when you, at the end of it, most of these local issues need someone physical in uniform to go around and do something.
Yeah.
So that implies that the problem they have is not capacity, but information. They don't know where their issues are.
I think that's right, but there's also an important point about delivery. I mean, what most citizens feel frustrated about is that either no one listens to me, no one cares about what my opinion is, or my experience is whenever I've tried to put something into the system or make a request, no one wrote back to me. I got pushed around on the phone, even though I was told on hold that my call was important. These sort of frustrations that they do build. And I think so. Stories like the ones you've shared from Boston, they do raise people's faith in the ability of the organisation to deliver for them. I think there's another important aspect too, and that is who is getting elected to these positions. And we've got this kind of conundrum for England and Wales where we're seeing a massive trend in local elections, very low turnout, roughly 1/3. But also lopsided results. So we have 20 million people who live in a local authority where one party has more than 3/4 of the seats.
Absolutely.
Now this introduces a massive partisan aspect, hyper-partisan aspect. There'll always be party politics. I'm not for a moment suggesting that will ever go away or suggesting it should, but we're getting now councils with huge control by one party, nothing like the share of the vote they get in their community. And while it's just one part of the puzzle, I think the fact that for many voters, the people they vote for never get elected, the kind of results where basically you have a one-party state running your area, does breed resentment on the part of the voter and contentment on the part of the politician. And so the whole thing is actually what might feel like a wonderful party on election night, wonderful celebration, quickly turns into disappointment and heartache for everybody involved in it. So I think addressing the electoral system and the way we vote so that people can see that their vote does count is an important thing.
Does proportional representation work at a council level where often it is much more about the individual? I mean, I helped canvass for a councillor who got re-elected in St Albans against the trend of a pretty bleak night for the Liberal Democrats, and it's because he is excellent, and he has a reasonable chance of actually meeting all of the people who voted for him, and which is presumably what you want in.
Well, I think I'd make a distinction, because I think councils, the scale of councils in the UK is probably too large for that direct contact with the citizen. That councillor you just talked about will be making decisions for, a population of 100,000 or something. I'm much more interested in, and Darren, you said not suggesting the end of party politics. I would suggest the end of party politics at the very local level, possibly not at local authority, but certainly at neighbourhood level, where I think political labels are just not relevant. It's about the quality of the individual.
Sorry, you go.
Well, I was going to say, one of the interesting things about mayors, and we're very in favour of directly elected metro mayors as a way to just create a recognisable leader. I think the fact that most people don't know who their councillor is, local leader is, a lot more people know who Boris Johnson is from the north of England than would know their local council leader. It is interesting. It doesn't counter your point about what happens if you don't kind of get the person you voted for. But I think that there's something interesting about, I suppose, that engagement at a local level and getting people interested, and then a mandate to do things, and then how that links with the kind of very local stuff, because mayors tend to be quite pragmatic. So what's interesting is lots of Labour mayors have worked very well with the coalition government, cross party lines. So would that introduce greater pragmatism, or does it make it easier? Because the one party local authorities you've mentioned, when I've spoken to people, some of that infighting in the party can make things really difficult. Difficult to do things.
In the end, it doesn't, quite apart from it being bad from the citizen, which should be our number one concern, it's actually not good for the party itself, because it's just too big a political grouping, and the infighting starts, and the poor decisions, and the recriminations, and eventually what happens in the studies we've done is that over a period of time that party loses total control anyway, because people give up hope on there's a rebuilding process. So the whole thing has been a waste of time. I think with respect to parish or neighbourhood councils, they do tend to be free of party label. But at local authority level, the point I was just making is that I can't see that going away. But I think in order to get independent people elected, it's very, very hard at the present time using first past the post. And the experience in Scotland, where they've used PR in local elections, they don't have uncontested seats where people think there's no point standing against Mr Jones, everyone votes for him. And it's also meant none of the hyper one-party state dominance of so that all the creativity that you're looking for will come to the fore more, because people then become used to sharing power at local authority level, working with central government of a different colour, maybe working with other authorities in the different nations of the UK, where there's different political persuasions as well. All of these things do unleash an ability to work beyond traditional methods. But if we insist on having so many people living in one-party states, we will get one-party thinking. And that will never be to give away power, control, money or influence. It will always be to keep it at Town Hall or Whitehall. That to me seems like a logical conclusion.
Giles, you were going to say something earlier about some of this.
Well, I've always been confused about how party politics works at a local authority level, precisely because of the pragmatism you mentioned. In the end, they feel that how things turn out locally is going to be sufficiently important that will be what determines their success at the next election, and then they will use whatever technique works. So the ideology that will necessarily flavour national politics, I don't know whether it's necessarily there. When somebody's tried to explain to me on the doorstep how they would do things differently, they're always just saying the same things about how they're going to be better with the bins and sort of listen out for things and make sure that Wandsworth's awful parking hotline works a little bit better, which would get my vote. But there's no party ideology here. There's no big left-right. We don't give them tax and spend levers of sufficient size to make that one count. So what exactly is left or right at the local level? It's hard really to say. They can't nationalise my local bakery. So, what is it they can do?
I suppose it's often, and we were talking about this earlier, delivery of services potentially, and that changing. Is it more co-production? Mm-hmm. Is it more outsourcing? Is it keeping that in-house? Is that changing the way you pay wages? Is it a conversation about that, or is it something slightly different? Because I think you're right that it's blurrier, it's different at the local level, which is one of the things that makes a conversation like this so interesting, because at the different levels, from neighbourhood right up, it's different, isn't it? There's not an easy solution.
I don't think I'd make a distinction between mayors and local authority leaders in that debate. I think if you get good people, either format will work. It's always seemed to me, though, that it's the getting the good people, and in order to get the good people, it's got to be a good job. It's got to be a job that somebody wants to do. It's got to have resources. It's got to have the ability to make a difference. And I think that is the British problem when it comes to local government, is we just don't give our local authorities enough resource, enough freedom to get on and do the things that they think are right. And if we did do that, there'd be a period of transition, but we would gradually get better and better and better people. And we've got some really good ones now, but imagine if the best people in the country decided that the job was to go and run a local authority. That was the thing they wanted to do.
That's precisely the formulation I've heard given by the Conservative minister trying to localise everything, saying if only, a Joseph Chamberlain character said, I'll tell you what I want to do is I want to take over my metropolis and really drive this. and they used to have the tools. They used to run the local gasworks. I mean, some of this is technological, obviously, but I mean, it's one of the reasons I'm slightly at variance with you two about whether the problem is that local authorities are too big and you need to shatter things into smaller sizes. When I see like the challenge posed this week by George Osborne about how do we get northern metropolises together, he's not saying we need to shatter things even more. He's talking about bringing them together. He's talking about agglomeration benefits, effectively. And that's not going to happen by breaking things down into ever smaller and closer to the citizen decisions. It's going to be by combining things.
But essentially he's only talking about investment in public transport, and I think we'd all agree that those big infrastructure projects need to be done at a level above the local authority. But when it comes to parking on my street, I don't want a supra-regional authority to be making those decisions.
There's a difficulty in there though, isn't there? Because yes, the decision to do this, to spend massive amounts of money on what's now called HS3, should be taken at a high level. But where it goes, where the stations are, where the disruptions are, those are all things that neighbourhood neighbourhoods of citizens are going to have huge interest in. And even smaller local authorities will want to make sure that if there's going to be benefit that they get some of it, because some of these projects actually, in order to get two big centres linked together, there are losses for smaller places along the way.
It's stories like that which are the reason we never build anything in this country, and so I don't think we've yet managed to cope with that tension, that the negative externalities are very local and all the positive ones are everywhere, and every government eventually starts trying to override the local objectives.
I think HS2 is an interesting example of that, because there is co-production going on, for example, around the design of the stations on HS2. And that's exactly that issue, isn't it? Mm-hmm. A decision has been made that there will be a railway and it will have a station in a particular city. But how the station is designed, how it fits into the infrastructure, that's something that local people have a genuine interest and contribution to make. And that is happening in the process. And if we'd left the HS2 authority to do that, they would have been awful, the stations. They
Much less the Chancellor. I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
Legitimately is not his concern or...
Yeah, although I think he has strong views on Euston's design, doesn't he?
I don't think perhaps not being the best at something stops anybody having views on it.
Not in senior government.
Not anyway, I'd suggest. But I mean, that point, Giles, and obviously from the Centre for Cities, we argue from an economic perspective, actually working at that functional economy level, the real one. Ignoring administrative boundaries, because you do when you travel to work, is really important on certain issues. I think a lot of what we've been talking about has been about where do you take decisions and how is that clearer to people. So on things like transport, housing's interesting. So if you look at Manchester, say, you've got a really interesting conversation going on in Greater Manchester about what kinds of houses where and how that works with an acceptance broadly that the centre of Manchester is where you get the high value jobs. And places like Oldham are doing a fantastic job of getting some of the lower value jobs that shouldn't take up expensive space in Manchester, but can benefit the whole conurbation. And there's an interesting conversation about what kind of houses where then. In bits of the beautiful leafy areas, you need certain kinds of houses. In Bury, which is north of Manchester, they've got more first-time buyer houses. So the decisions about houses are not just being made locally, where you might have slightly different ones, but also in the context of that wider debate. And I think that's where housing is quite an interesting tension there, isn't it? Because it's such an emotive, important issue, and yet one that affects the bigger picture and has a big impact on people's opportunities. And local decisions might prevent some of those opportunities, but so might bigger decisions might mess them up as well.
And in Manchester, there's a classic boundary tension, because Greater Manchester is not the functional housing area for Manchester. It goes further south into Cheshire in particular. And the authorities in Cheshire currently are doing things which, are actively undermining the policies that are going on to reject. Basically more housing in the green belt or around pockets around the green belt, which undermines the regeneration potential of the city centre. And that's a market tension, but it's one that's probably best planned and governed by a collaborative approach, which in theory should be going on, rather than a competitive approach between local authorities.
I'm not sure how you can incentivise them to. So the people, is it Cheshire are inconveniently building more houses than Manchester would like them to?
Whether it's Cheshire versus Manchester in those political terms, but in market terms, if Manchester's got this huge reservoir of brownfield land close to the city centre, which could be developed for medium density housing, ideally suited actually to the economic needs of the conurbation, meeting the needs of younger people in creative industries and knowledge industries and so on. But as you build houses outside in the rural hinterland, that sucks out demand from the conurbation and makes that much harder to do.
Coming from London, it's unfamiliar to find that the problem is that there's too little demand in the centre of the city for the plans they would like.
And too much building on the outskirts of the areas. Yeah,
nice problem to have.
But I mean, all of this has been about thinking about decisions at different levels, really, isn't it? And thinking about how that might change the relationship people have, because Darren's point, low turnout. We have disgracefully low turnout to local elections. You compare it to people around the world, it's so low. And is that about lack of powers locally? We're doing some work to see if a lot of people would like more powers locally, but they're not clear what they are.
Can I just jump in with one stat? Because you said only a third of people voted, which is right. But in the last election, which was local and European, a third of people didn't even know there was an election. So you've got a third, haven't you? You've got a third who didn't know, a third who voted, and you've got the third in the middle who knew but didn't care.
Couldn't prioritise. I mean, and there's plenty of things that could be done to improve that, including just a little bit more flexibility about when and where people can vote. The idea that you get sent a card and told you must go and vote at a particular building, no matter what you're doing else on that day, sort of does imply a degree of out of touchness on the political class who think everyone's running around that day for them. But so there are little things like that. But I think what's fascinating is that a lot of voters in surveys actually feel that their council is more responsive than their government, and that they can articulate more of the services they get from their council than from their government. And yet the turnout in a general election is touching on 2/3. It's declining as well as political culture problem is in free fall, but it's still it's quite significantly higher, 30% higher than what we saw in the most recent local election. So there is this disjunct between people saying, quite like my council, quite like what they do, but just can't be bothered to go and vote. And then on the other hand saying Westminster's out of touch, but it's more people thinking it's their duty to go and vote every 5 years.
I suspect part of that is people's awareness, though a general election, I suspect a much higher proportion of the population are aware that there's something going on.
And it's like the cup final by then. I mean, by then you're trying. You've had 4 or 5 years of hating the bastards, and now you want to have a go. And whereas the local is a totally different dynamic. I mean, so it seems natural to me that people don't feel that they're going to have as responsive a central government. You're not likely to have a view on foreign policy and then notice them and jump. Unless you get one of those incredible moments during the election campaign that when you literally get very, very close to the politician, it doesn't feel that way. Whereas in the local, you have got a chance of meeting them, which I suppose is a merit.
But so do you think more powers is the answer? So, I mean, we're massively centralised. Is it more powers to local government on the proviso that they don't just grab them? Is it being clear on what powers they do have, which we'd certainly say are too limited, but I think you're right, people say they feel like they know more, but actually they think the council gets business rates. Get business rate, starting to. But so there's is it around that? Is it something different? Is it about making the campaign more exciting? I mean, would mayors do that? Make the job more attractive, so you get more noise around it, so you do get that general awareness. I mean, what do you think might be some of the things that could start to shift this? Because given how many billions councils do spend, even in austerity, they spend billions, big impact on the local economy. It does seem quite shocking that you do have a 30 don't know, a 30 don't care, and then a 30 bother to show up.
It doesn't feel that shocking to me, to be honest. A lot of what councils do are hygiene factors. They're things that people just expect to be done well, and because councils do them pretty efficiently on the whole, they don't become controversial. But I think we are at a moment where we can push a lot more down to the level below local authorities. And I think you'll get more engaged citizens that way. And once you've got more engaged citizens, there's probably a bigger chance that they'll pay a bit more attention to what's happening at the next level of government as well.
I do agree with that. The only thing I'd add is that I think we've got to fix the problem of representation at the council level, so that central government has confidence, but also so that we have properly functioning, properly representative local authorities who, when they're making these decisions to take things down to neighbourhood level, are doing them for sound public policy reasons, not because they happen to control 80% of the seats on the council, and there's some real gerrymandering going on, and I think I think that the politicians who are understandably reluctant to move at Whitehall on this will have more confidence to do so, I think, if they can see genuinely flourishing democracies operating at local authority level.
I do take your point about what happens in the kind of one-party states, but I'd also add to that the problems of hung councils, and we see some very odd behaviours happening in hung councils where people are becoming populist, I guess, in the sense that populist might be a pejorative word, and whether I probably, I think, back the idea that some kind of proportional representation would probably help to ameliorate both those ends of the problematic governance we have at local authority level.
I think one shouldn't be too optimistic, and I say this because I read a book by Andrew Marr before New Labour came in called Ruling Britannia, about the stripping away of local authority democracy, I guess. And it was at the time when the word quango was such a dirty word. All these things have been taken away from local authorities and given to quangos. And that, plus the natural evolution of various services like the local gas companies and so forth coming together, means that people look to their local authorities naturally for far, far less. And that probably built up over decades and decades. Now, it got turned around at lots of different moments. I mean, the most recent one is the council tax seems to become a meaningless thing nowadays, that you can't raise it at all. I mean, this is what kind of a localising government doesn't allow you to do that without an expensive referendum. But the uniform business rates, another decision that took things away. These sorts of things, and then austerity has made it worse. That when you speak to local growth experts, like some of the authors of this excellent book I've been reading, they say that you're asking local authorities to be into growth. They're struggling just to keep their heads above water with their basic social services and planning and so forth. Are you saying, and what's your plan for bringing the next nanotechnology centre down there? I mean, this is crazy. So these are people who don't feel that they've got any powers and are struggling to stay up, and so they're just going to be working on survival. And it's not really surprising if people think the interesting proactive policy making is now happening elsewhere when they're in that sort of a state.
So I think just thinking, because we've ranged widely, which is as it should be when we're talking about a stronger, healthy democracy, through from reforming the electoral system through to thinking about institutions, talking about the tension in a country where postcode lottery remains a dirty phrase, a bad thing, the difficulty of accepting that actually you get difference, and you will get difference and you'll get some failure. The challenges of hoarding power, at whichever level you get it, and not pushing it down to kind of local communities. The way that the jobs just aren't attractive enough, I suppose, was that last point, because actually you're just presiding over a shrinking budget and growing demand. You know, the graph of doom showing the cost of social care will outstrip your budgets in the early 2020s. So, talked about institutions, talked about electoral reform, talked about diversity, talked about that kind of co-production and how you get the local authority actually working with citizens. What do you think, if I do that annoying thing that chairs do, where I ask you for the one thing that you think might help, but I mean, we're going into the general election. Now's the time, people are starting to think about not just some of the solutions that will build economic growth, some of the things that will tackle inequality, but also power and democracy. And particularly with the rise of UKIP, I do think that's brought that to the fore, and you can see people much more engaged and concerned with, well, why are certain communities voting UKIP so strongly? Why are they rejecting the mainstream political parties? What might be the one, or stretch to two, things that you'd like to see in the election being talked about that you think might really help with this? Darren?
Sure, I think the challenge is to rebuild trust and confidence. So trust in in the system, trust in the politicians, but most of all, trust in the citizens, so that we can enable far many more decisions to be taken locally, but also critically reforming the way we're represented by changing the electoral system for local government, so that we can start to bring more people into the system, make people see that it's worthwhile, and then ensure that real powers are given to make the entire effort being seen to be worthwhile.
Yeah, great. Chris?
I think as you change systems of governance, whether it's local economic partnerships or whether it's down at neighbourhood level, you have to do it in a way which is going to be effective in getting things done. I think most people they're not as interested in policy debates as the political class are. They're much more interested in being able to influence how things get done that they're interested in. So, for example, at local level, we need to understand what a neighbourhood is, where are the boundaries of the neighbourhood, and we need to resource those neighbourhoods so that people can genuinely take control of what's going on around them.
Two very clear suggestions: a proper local property tax. So I think a missed opportunity has been made with the mansion tax, where it's described as just going after mostly expat, obscenely wealthy people. Every local authority should simply have a revalued extra band of council tax, and they can set the rate. It can be like a flat rate or a fixed amount or whatever they like. But local councils should feel they can raise money from their property and be accountable for it.
Can we have 20 bands, please, rather than just one? Let's go all the way.
I will offer you 12.
Done.
This is how deals are done.
This is how behind the scenes they work. And the other one, electronic voting. I mean, let some local authorities trial voting with an app, and boy, that could change everything.
Fantastic. Well, I think a wide range of ideas, but actually the themes, powers, where they go, who makes the decisions, trust, building it, getting the right people engaged at different levels, and getting more people just, I suppose, talking about these issues at whatever level and engaging in it and participating in it. It's been a hugely interesting discussion. Thank you all very much for joining me, and I hope all of you will have enjoyed it and will join us for future Think Cities discussions, www.thinkcities.org. Thank you very much.